This is the March 7th presentation of the North Texas Church of Freethought. And we'll talk a little bit about determinism. The plan is to put this up on YouTube, and our YouTube followers can then make comment. I certainly hope you do make some comments, and please also click on the upper right, at least it's where my desktop layout is for YouTube. If you click that bell, that will notify you of additional uploads that we have. And we'll give you some additional information later about our Facebook and Twitter feeds, and go to our website. Anyways, welcome everyone who's viewing this. We're going to talk about determinism, and this is really the famous quote from the 18th century French philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, just really a what they call a polymath. Nobody can know as much today, with there being so much to know, as some of these polymaths of the past, but this was Pierre Simon Laplace. Now, this is the same fellow who famously responded to Napoleon's question, because Laplace had written this big book called Celestial Mechanics, and Napoleon had asked him, well, gee, where is God in this? And Laplace had famously answered, I had no need of that hypothesis. So the idea here is that in Laplace's day, Newtonian mechanics had taken a hold, and he said that an intellect that knew all the forces and positions of all the items of which things are composed, both past and present, at any point in that, if you knew that, you would be able to see into the future and into the past. And indeed, we have something like that now, because NASA can go back and tell us when the eclipses happened in the past, because of celestial mechanics being pretty much as predictable as this for the most part. And this has actually been a very interesting way to date some things in history, where some commentator would say, oh, an eclipse happened last month on this day, and then what happened next week and so forth. They could go back, and that would be a marker for them to actually set dates and time. So Laplace's idea has come to fruition in some respects. Determinism, as Laplace expressed it, is pretty clear and straightforward. It's based on Newton's laws of motion and the general idea of all observable events being governed by natural law. But what is the opposite of determinism? It's not that simple, because indeterminism could be the result of more than one thing, or one or another thing. Could be random chance, that might be a factor. There might be some inability or even the impossibility of any intellect being able to know all the forces and all the positions of all items of which nature is composed, as Laplace put it. Or, of course, there could be supernatural items, such as deities and so forth, as some claim, or free will, quote unquote, of some non-physical soul or personal essence being able to cancel or at least influence the laws of physics, as Laplace understood them. But of course, that's a real question, because if there's free will, then of what or whom? If this supernatural soul can interact with the material world, by what means would it do so? And if it could do so, it must do so by some mechanical means. So it would then become a part of the physical world, and it should be measurable. It should be something that is part of physics. But clearly, this has been an impervious problem. Even Einstein kind of gotten things mixed up a bit. He famously said that God does not play dice with the universe. And he was certainly an atheist, not believing in the Abrahamic deity or in any personal deity that hears prayers and intervenes in human affairs. Rather, it's often said that Einstein believed in Spinoza's God, an impersonal force or order of some kind. We may think of many reasons that Einstein may have played around with this term God, especially during the Cold War as an immigrant in the USA. At the same time, we see here this reference to free will. But what he meant by that, I'm not certain that he ever really explained very well. Or perhaps it doesn't matter, because Einstein makes clear that he is in the camp of Laplace and his invisible piper. It's just that those same physical forces and items that Laplace referred to, according to Einstein, there were hidden variables behind quantum uncertainty, and we'll mention that again coming up too. Here we see another physicist, the famous and late Stephen Hawking, suggesting that determinism and human decision-making are to be thought of in opposition. But Hawking would certainly have also rejected the idea that people's decisions to look before crossing the road are a result of any supernatural souls. I think he would agree that they happen because of deterministic things happening in the brain. Does the idea of a multiverse provide a solution? Does everything that can happen actually happen, but perhaps in different parallel realities? If so, then what determines that we are in one universe rather than another? Why are we now in the universe where the SARS-2 virus escaped from Wuhan and spread over the whole world, and not in the universe where that never happened? Well, the obvious answer is that in that other universe, we are there too, never even thinking to ask why are we not living through a pandemic, just as now, in the universe we inhabit, we're not asking why we are not in the universe where a nuclear exchange wiping out our species did not happen decades ago. But those answers are too easy, and so we must seriously ask, as we should of all ideas that explain everything and anything, whether that idea is wrong. Determinism can be applied to all sorts of events. As I said earlier, it can be applied to the celestial mechanics such that we can go back in time and tell when eclipses happened. We may all ask also how it applies in each of these different situations here. So physics, biology, psychology, behavior, economics, society, culture, and history. Clearly, though, if we could not depend on determinism, then we would not have a spacecraft, rover, helicopter exploring Mars right now, nor would we have several effective vaccines against the SARS-2 virus, not to mention all the other technological innovations that are a part of our everyday lives, from electric lights to telephones and automobiles. The only indeterministic aspect of such things is that nobody foresaw them, even a few decades before they became commonplace, or even that they would become commonplace. Where were the predictions of the way we live now hundreds of years ago? They weren't there. Certainly, nobody foresaw them. Even the idea that civilizations and societies could be governed by deterministic forces has been explored. Isaac Asimov, the famous science fiction writer, did that in some of his fiction. He called it psychohistory. But there are people who also speculated about that, which we'll get to in a minute. One guy who did a lot of predicting about how the future was going to unfold and was very much accepted as a scientific thinker at the time was Karl Marx. But of course, it never really worked out as he thought. He said that capitalism would lead to a concentration of capital, declining profits because of competition, and underconsumption because the workers were not paid enough to buy back the stuff they were making. Then you would have increased unemployment and all of these cyclical recessions and depressions, which they were beginning to see in the 19th century. But somehow, as I said, that didn't turn out that way. Not that it destroyed Marxism to have things turn out otherwise. Some ideas are just too good to let go, especially when people cannot think of better ones. As you see here, Marx foresaw and predicted for the future the population percentage, the workers poor, and the population percentage in the middle class decreasing to zero, or the rich got richer. And what we actually saw is a huge growth of the middle class. Population percentage of the poor has actually decreased. People are misled by this. If you look up the numbers, there is a lot less poverty in the world now than there were 50 and certainly 100 years ago. And the upper class, of course, people living better. And of course, if you do it in percentiles, they'll always be the high percentiles. But the proportion of people having really quite a high living standard has increased. No question about that. As I said, though, it's easier to go from I know something to I know a better something than to go from I know something to I don't know. And there's often a way to assert that something that's very wrong is, in a way, right. So, in fact, we have seen some of the things that Marx predicted. And as I said, you could see that Marx actually was right. This is E.O. Wilson, the famous entomologist. Entomology is the study of insects, and E.O. Wilson said Karl Marx was right. Socialism works. It's just that he had the wrong species. And you see ants, bees, and a big termite mound there on the lower right. That's E.O. Wilson with his hand up to his head. The Austrian-British philosopher Karl Popper, we've discussed some of his ideas before. He was once a Marxist, but then took his previous ideology to task, especially, or I should say beginning, in the second volume of his famous 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Highly recommended these two books. really a lot you can learn from that, and his writing style is very entertaining and engaging, I think. Popper later critiqued the idea of historicism, of historical determinism, which actually originated with the philosopher Hegel, and Marx picked that up, and that's where he went with it. This is Popper's 1957 books, The Poverty of Historicism. The first quote here on the top is a quote from that book, that if we're uncritical, we'll always find what we want. He's talking about, of course, what we now call confirmation bias. Not only that, but if you're uncritical of things, you're going to look away from what appears to be overwhelming evidence against your theory because you just don't want to see it. That lower quote is from another of his works. That's his work called 1972, Objective Knowledge and Evolutionary Approach. Also just an excellent idea that when a theory appears to you as the only possible one, think about something that you think explains something and you think there couldn't possibly be any other explanation. He says, take this as a sign that you've neither understood the theory nor the problem which it was intended to solve. There's yet another of Popper's works, which I have yet to read. It's titled An Argument for Indeterminism. Would be interesting to explore that. We can come back. All of these subjects we've come back to again and again. Thinking is an inexhaustible activity for sure. So here's a prediction made by the Jesus character in the New Testament that is held up probably the best of any biblical prophecy of all. For ye have the poor with you always. That was 2,000 years ago, and we still have the poor, so that turned out correct. Or we might question it a little bit because the poorest person in the United States today has a greater life expectancy and a better standard of living than pretty much anyone had 2,000 years ago. But here was the advice that was offered in the Bible. And what would happen if everybody followed that advice? Can you imagine if tomorrow everybody was out selling everything they had in order to give to the poor? And you give to the poor something they can't eat, namely money or whatever you would get from selling. Not very consistent with the categorical imperative, the fancy Immanuel Kant philosopher's formulation of the golden rule: act only according to that maxim, that you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. It's just not reasonable to think that everybody's going to go out and sell all they have or try to sell all they have. What happens when everyone tries to go out and sell their stock? Well, we all know what happens to the stock market then. But we can't take any solace or think that we're so much smarter these days. We were supposed to have all of these personal helicopters by now. We were supposed to have our brains directly connected to computers and the internet, if anybody could imagine it back in the 1950s. And only a little while before these amazing predictions, the telephone would never amount to anything you see on the lower left. And the wireless music box, the radio, well, that had no imaginable commercial value. Will Elon Musk make it to Mars? That remains to be seen too. So determinism, as we know, does not apply in the quantum realm, and it doesn't apply, at least not in any workable way, to a lot of other things. On the other hand, indeterminism does not mean that we cannot make good predictions about a great many things if we can identify a trend and extrapolate. We can get a little ways, but we have to remember all the things that can derail it, and that certainly happened with Marx's predictions. We can make a lot of predictions about human behavior, though. I can confidently predict that a great number of people I know are not going to commit a murder today. I am less confident about that prediction for next month or next year. And we know that's how it works with the weather, too. We can believe the weather forecast in the near term, but longer term, a little more difficult. But quantum indeterminacy does not mean that anyone or anything, let alone an immaterial supernatural soul, can determine or even influence the collapse of a quantum wave function. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle is not a basis to suppose that sort of free will. Claims to the contrary are, as we say, woo-woo, crazy stuff. And so it comes down to this. Is the universe more like a clock, or is it more like a pinball machine? And the answer is obviously that in some respects it is like clockwork, and in other respects like the pinball machine. Except even the pinball machine is a static thing that is going to be the same when you come back next week, whereas the world is different, and human society evolves and changes. And also, what is random is no more in our control than what is deterministic. So even if it's a pinball machine, it's no warrant for thinking about this supernatural free will. There is free will, but it is a subjective sensation, not some supernatural phenomenon. It does come down to chance and necessity. That was the title of Nobel Prize-winning French biochemist Jacques Monod's 1971 book. That is an excerpted quote on the right in which he points out that science looks for and makes sense of the quote-unquote Platonic element. He's talking about ideals. So Platonic elements are Plato's idea that everything exists in a realm of ideals. So we experience individual things, individual chairs, individual cats, individual clouds, but in some far-off realm of thought, there are idealized, perfect clouds, cats, chairs, and so forth. But here's a real-world illustration of that, of what Monod was talking about. Quartz, silicon dioxide, crystallizes as a six-sided prism that you see up on the upper left. But you rarely see quartz like this. Quartz is the second most common mineral on Earth. And what we're familiar with is more like the pieces of rock that you see on the lower right. They're disorganized aggregations, which on the microscopic level are kind of trying to achieve the ideal form. And most all of science is like this. The regularities that we strive to discover, that are published in the journals and that we learn in school, are in everyday life, in actual application, usually obscured by random effects. Even so simple a thing as inertia took a long time to figure out. Because of things like friction and air resistance, it appears that objects in motion only stay in motion while a force propels them. That's what the ancients believed. But of course, Newton's first law of motion is that objects in motion or at rest tend to stay in motion or at rest until and unless a force acts upon them. And just think about how difficult it is to persuade many people that climate change is happening. People have a certain inertia. Our thoughts have a certain inertia. And we ourselves have an ideal version of ourselves, the way we picture ourselves in our minds. And yet, as we go through our lives every day, we see that there's quite a lot of deviation from that. Doesn't mean that we don't have that picture of ourselves, but we have to remember that's the idealized form that we strive towards getting to. And this is the challenge that the North Texas Church of Freethought seeks to meet. We're striving to meet the challenge of believing the fewest wrong things as possible, while making sense of the human condition and the human predicament, the problem. And actually, Popper has another book like that, I think it's called All Life is Problem Solving. Our life is a problem, and everything we encounter is a problem, and there's going to be problems until there are no problems in the grave. So let's not look forward to that. We at the Church of Freethought are reimagining religion as our supreme value, how we encounter and explain what it is like to be ourselves, and how to live satisfying lives together on our shared planet, always being ready to admit mistakes and do better. Quick recap or reminder, interestingly enough, March 7th, this is the day of the year that in 1876, patent number 174465, you see there, was issued to this guy named Alexander Graham Bell for this invention of his that he called the telephone. Only 24 years later, a German ship sent the first wireless signals to shore. Of course, you connect telephone with wireless, and what do you get? These little boxes that we all carry that take pictures and all sorts of other things, and even allow us to participate in Zoom calls. Interestingly, just to fill in a few blanks here and put things in perspective, in 1878, only 2 years after that patent was issued, the first commercial telephone exchange was up and running in New Haven, Connecticut. And in 1914, the U.S. First transcontinental telephone line was completed. Meanwhile, you see where Marx was in all of that. He died in 1883, right in the midst of all of this. He did not live to see all the things that destroyed his predictions of the future. And I think we could probably go on from there. We'll save some of that for another future time. What might the future be like given all the trends? I personally think we're going to have to get to the point where people don't want anything anymore, and that can't be until we have machines to produce all the goods and services that anyone could ever want. That day is a day off, though. Here are our principles. As freethinkers, we prize reason because it is how we comprehend everything that there is to make sense of, how we enjoy, how we learn to be happy. Appreciation, how we recognize what is good. And of course, it's opposite, how we learn to recognize what is not good, what is to be avoided. And love, how to discover meaning and purpose. It is not given to us, meaning and purpose. This is something that we must find for ourselves, and everybody finds a little bit different version of it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and in fact, everything good with that, because we can then appreciate, number 3 there, the value, the meaning and purpose that other people find in what they have. As we go on with our discussions that we usually have after our presentations on Sundays, when we have presentations, which is not always, but we always try to bear in mind, we don't want especially politics to wreck civility. Religion, politics, and sex, those are the 3 things that supposedly really wreck things up. But we like religion. We like to talk about it. We like to, well, sex is okay too, but kind of a personal matter. Everybody's got a different taste there. But politics, oh my gosh. Let's remember, there are principles of civility. We've put up 15 of them in the past, just 2 more to realize. Strive to understand what other people are trying to say. You might think you understand them, but if you are thinking you understand them, that they're bad people, then maybe you haven't quite understood that, because no one likes to be thought of as a bad person. Number 6 of the 15 is to be inclusive. There's no one who has nothing to contribute. Perhaps if they're asleep or in a coma, that could be true. But generally, everyone has something that you could learn from. Remember also that we are embodied minds. As you go through life and in our discussions with each other, your posture, your voice, and your physical behavior matters. There's a wonderful book called Wittgenstein's Poker, and it's about a famous incident between Karl Popper, the philosopher we were just talking about, and another philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, when they got into a little bit of a disagreement, Wittgenstein picked up a poker. They were near a fireplace and started waving it about and challenged Popper to say, well, give me one objective moral principle. And Popper said, well, not to wave a poker in another person's face. So remember, physical behavior communicates something too. Don't communicate what you don't want to communicate. Your physical behavior influences your thinking and is also a clue to your emotional state. The Dalai Lama, we could pick this apart too. This is a great thing to deconstruct. You can think about this on your own time. When you talk, you're only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new. We don't learn a whole lot. I think we do learn something by talking, but we learn more by listening to other people. And there is a biblical passage that says, iron sharpens iron. So your interaction with other people is a blessing to you, and it's something that you should appreciate as what it is. And remember, too, that Freethought is not free. Please visit and donate at our church website. There you see it, www.churchoffreethought.org. Lots of material there. We would love to have you come and peruse what we have there. We do depend on your continued support. You can also sign up at the bottom of any page to participate live in our Sunday Zoom sessions. Visit us on Facebook and Twitter. There's the facebook.com/North Texas Church of Freethought. Also, twitter.com/NTCOF. And as I said, the churchoffreethought.org. We depend on your continued support. Why should you give us your money? Well, quite briefly, we're doing together what none of us can do on our own. And seriously, you can only give 9%. It's fine. We don't demand 10%. 8% even. We'll take that. Whatever you feel is worth it to you. Help us promote your values, though. That's what we're trying to do. Live your commitment and be the future that you wish to see. And with that, we generally will adjourn to question and answer discussion. This particular video we're recording after the March 7th service, but I had all this material, so I wanted to put it up and hope you enjoyed it. Please join us next time, March 14th, and we'll talk about something entirely new and different. Thank you.